Starting with Section 16, we have 3 sections left in Module 10, which will wrap up the entire 10-module training program. Let's not waste any time and start our sprint to the finish line. The title here being Pros and Cons of Working with Asset-Based versus Non-Asset-Based IMCs, those freight forwarders for the rail. Much like decisions made about other modes of transport, air, ocean, truck, the selection of intermodal services must be done in a strategic fashion. Within the framework of an integrated inbound supply chain, decisions on intermodal transportation must be made within the context of the entire upstream supply chain network. This has been a common theme throughout all of our modules. It's certainly not going to change at the end. Last bullet. A key decision around intermodal transportation is based on the use of asset-based or non-asset-based IMCs. We're not here to favor one over the other. We're going to point out some pros and cons. For a number of reasons. IMCs, both those asset and non-asset-based players, have an important role in the intermodal ecosystem. First, most shippers work with IMCs as opposed to directly with the railroads. That's definitely true. However, as we see in our sub-bullet point, very large shippers can work directly with the railroads, but typically, not always, but typically these are bulk shippers that use equipment other than 53-foot trailers. Last bullet, also, IMCs can provide an integrated service that includes origin dray, rail transportation, and the destination dray too. That's probably more important than anything in this whole setup because rail represents the lion's share of the transportation from a distance perspective, but without an origin dray and a destination dray, it's really not worth that much. IMCs provide that integrated service. By using an integrated service through an IMC, the importer does not need to provide drayage to the origin ramp or from the destination ramp. Second bullet, IMCs typically have geographic coverage and operational relationships around the country, especially those bigger IMCs. Third bullet, when working with multiple IMCs, an importer can work with them collectively and or individually to flex up or down on equipment needs during peak or slack season. Really quite important, especially when we're running a transload operation where we have a trailer pool that we're managing, as we spoke of previously, and we have to have access to equipment to run the operation. Trade tip, we already said this, think of an IMC as a freight forwarder for rail shipments. We'll kick off our analysis by talking about the advantages of working with asset-based IMCs. Whereas both asset and non-asset-based IMCs can definitely provide the services we've mentioned thus far, there are some differences between the two. Starting with our second bullet point, some advantages of working with these asset-based IMCs are, first and foremost, access to IMC-owned equipment. And we're talking about the trailers, the chassis, the power units for drayage, etc. It's their own gear. Second, asset-based IMCs are likely to have agreements with the major railroads, the 7 that we talked about. Maybe not all, but certainly a good handful thereof. Also, lower prices based on volume buying power of the large IMCs to the benefit of the shipper. As part of asset investments made by these IMCs, they're likely to have tracking devices on their equipment, GPS on trailers, and, not all the time, but a good percentage of company-employed drayage drivers. They might use a mix of owner-operators too, but these big IMCs do have a lot of their own employees. Some other advantages of working with asset-based IMCs? They have a backup network of owner-operator, origin-destination drayage providers. We just said that at the tail end of the last slide. Another important consideration, second sub-bullet, is their own internal management of hours of service for their drayage drivers. HOS applies to drayage people in the intermodal rail environment. The bigger IMCs could have influence with the railroads during peak season, meaning having access to trains and such. They will use key performance indicators and have report writing capabilities. Some potential disadvantages of working with asset-based IMCs. Some of these asset-based companies work with a particular or limited number of railroads. That is indeed true. One big IMC working predominantly with one big railroad. We won't go into who's who, but that is definitely a true statement. From a shipper perspective, we might have to enter into high volume commitments to earn better pricing with these IMCs, making big commitments in terms of number of loads. Third sub-bullet is important, and this has to do with weekly allocations of trailers based on yearly usage. And that just means a total volume commitment divided by 50 weeks or 52 weeks with no consideration of peak usage periods. The ocean lines work this way too, giving allocations based on the total commitment, the minimum quantity commitment to use ocean terminology, divide by 50 or 52, usually 52, and that's how many containers a week the importer gets. It's the same thing in intermodal. And when there are peaks and an importer goes way above the average, that becomes a problem. A couple of other potential disadvantages of working with asset-based IMCs: high surcharges for containers used beyond weekly allocation, lack of equipment during peak, limited free time. That is a very important issue. The free time is typically considerably less than the free time one might see on ocean containers, and the potential for a laundry list of accessorial charges. More on that in an upcoming section. Let's switch over now and talk about the advantages of working with non-asset-based IMCs. First, there are lots of them. There are many players to choose from a two-person operation to large organizations. There are lots and lots of non-asset-based IMCs out there. Non-asset-based IMCs typically can work with multiple railroads as well. Depending on their size, non-asset-based IMCs can definitely offer competitive pricing. That is a fact. And they may have more flexibility in their pricing strategies because they're smaller organizations without a lot of hierarchy and bureaucratic decision-making processes. They can respond very quickly in a spot market. What other advantages for non-asset-based IMCs? Depending on where they are and what coverage they have, non-asset-based IMCs can have direct relationships with drayage carriers. Also, from a shipper perspective, there doesn't have to be a volume commitment. Spot quotes are quite common. That can be helpful at different times during the year. Not always, but as we see in our third sub-bullet, there can be more personalized service, especially from the smaller IMCs that have to fight for every load that they get. And lastly, non-asset-based IMCs can be very helpful during peak season when equipment is unavailable, especially from asset-based IMCs. It might be a little bit more expensive, but it's definitely a pressure valve release working with non-asset-based IMCs that can get stuff done. Let's bring in a supply chain perspective entitled Non-Asset-Based IMCs and Equipment Usage. A reasonable question to ask about the non-asset-based IMC model is that if the IMC doesn't own or lease its own equipment, where does the equipment come from? The answer to this question is actually analogous to the ocean freight container model in that the majority of containers used by the non-asset-based IMCs are actually provided by the railroads. Second paragraph. When dealing specifically with rail containers/trailers, the railroads not only deal with IMCs that use their own equipment, those same railroads provide a fleet of equipment that non-asset-based IMCs can essentially lease on a shipment-specific basis, just like an ocean container. Last sentence, second paragraph. Not only do railroads provide IMCs with equipment for use on their tracks, they also have what are called domestic interline container agreements with other railroads. Last paragraph. For example, the Union Pacific Railroad provides EMP trailers that are used on an interline basis between the UP and Norfolk Southern. Another example is the UMAX equipment that is deployed by the UP and CSX for its interline needs. Ultimately, this access to equipment across multiple railroads allows non-asset-based IMCs to serve the needs of shippers around the country. Continuing on with this supply chain perspective, just some visuals on examples of railroad-provided equipment. That's the EMP gear that we talked about on the left-hand side and the UMAX equipment we talked about on the right-hand side. Just some added visuals to bring some flavor to the story. Last slide in this section, finishing up with some potential disadvantages of working with non-asset-based IMCs. Most obviously, they have no direct control over the assets. It's someone else's equipment. They may have limited geographic coverage as well. Depending on where loads are going to or coming from, third sub-bullet, non-asset-based IMCs may have a lack of drayage relationships in different parts of the country. That's a very real possibility. There could be higher prices compared to the asset-based IMCs. There could also be higher accessorials. We have to pay attention to that and negotiate both line haul and accessorials. And because the equipment belongs to somebody else, depending on the time of year, location, etc., a non-asset-based IMC could suffer from limited ability to get equipment and or limited free time on that equipment. We'll stop here for this section. Hopefully we provided an objective portrayal of the pros and cons, advantages, disadvantages between asset-based and non-asset-based IMCs. When we come back, we're going to get into the intermodal transportation pricing considerations. See you later.